the reconquest of the Soviet Union and the socialist world, that, it happened differently in China, but all of this, they didn't just put back what was there before. They put back something that they could control. They didn't just say, oh, let's create a capitalist rival for us so that we're back in the same situation where we're facing global revolution. Instead, these countries were put together in a way that made this centralization of power possible. And then, of course, the digitality as the world system is the cage, that finalizes it all. And people don't realize, they think the money, they just spit it out of their ass. That's not where it came from. It came from the plunder of the Soviet Union. That was the richest society that had ever existed. That and China together, fabulously wealthy. They went and they took all that, and that went to Wall Street, and they built this cage around us with that. The dot-com, all of this was real money. Now they're trying to abolish money. Really, they're trying to separate capital liquidity from wage money, so to create something new. And this is their big difficulty and puzzle. And I don't think they're ready to, well, who knows? Maybe it'll happen tomorrow. I think they know that if they blow up the money, then they destabilize themselves. How are they going to control the groups that they've armed?
Yeah, I think a lot of I think what they like to do is introduce like a technocratic system where they have, instead of capital, they have like an energy accounting system, and then if you tie that to like your carbon limit or whatever, then you have effective control over populations. I think it's a really good...
they want to reduce the population enormously.
Absolutely,
that's a big thing.
The best estimate by leading vaccine producers is that it could take a year or more to develop, test, and manufacture a vaccine for the Clade X
virus. We have heard that 500,000 children have died. Is the price worth it? That the price, we think the price is worth it?
Richie Brown Show.
Welcome to the Richie Brown Show, and today we have Molly on as my guest, and she's going to walk us through the communist movement in various countries, various topics we're going to touch on, including the COVID, the 2020 event, and many more. Molly, if you want to introduce yourself?
Molly, I have the Red Kahina. I'm usually known by Red Kahina now, although I had different names in the internet world. I used to have a blog called Alphonse von Burden, and then one called Colonel Chabert. And if you search me, you will find those names, comments and stuff. I did a lot of comments on other people's blogs back in 15 years ago, let's say. And I started about 20 years ago, sort of discovered the internet. And I'm living in Sicily, and I don't have much to say about myself. My life is not that interesting if you want to ask specific questions, but let's just go right to the subjects.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, okay, so COVID, should we get to COVID?
Why not? I mean, 2020 sounds like a good year to start.
Yeah, so why don't you tell me a little bit about you first, because I was just really reading, and it's all very interesting. Did you know? I mean, did you realize it was bullshit from the start?
Not at all. Not at all. To my great shame, I did not. I had taken the view that because I was following some internet stuff around about December, and it was all about the virus coming out of Wuhan at that time, before it really hit the mainstream news. It sort of started to hit it, I think, around the New Year. And that's when they struck Soleimani in Iran. Or I think he was in Iraq at that time, and they struck him there.
Yes.
And I took that to be, I just went down a completely wrong rabbit hole, in other words. I took that to be that they struck Soleimani, and they had at the same time released the bioweapon worldwide. And then it took me quite a long time to realize. It took me until about 2022 when the excess deaths, people dropping dead all over the shop, like the athletes dropping dead. At that point, I was like, what have they injected the population with? And I went back and kind of reassessed my view, and I ended up going through studying the whole of virology and germ theory, finding out how that's a complete fraud. Like, like, I mean, I'm a communist, but it was a shock to me that they've managed just to create an entire scientific field out of whole cloth that has no basis in reality whatsoever. So it took me much longer than it needed to. Yeah. But how about you?
Okay,
You knew it was fake off
we
the
were
bat, right?
living, my husband and I were living, and my husband is like the most important critic of the Gates Foundation. So he's been knowing about this for a long time. His essays have been published in the Encyclopedia of Public Health and a lot in ROOP India, which is the Aspects of the Indian Economy's website. It's like a Maoist journal. And he wrote in the years pretty close to the beginning of this plague program, he wrote an article called The Real Agenda of the Gates Foundation, which everyone should read. So he had this background already, kind of expecting, knowing what they were doing. I have to say, so we were living in the epicenter of the epicenter near Elmhurst, a short walk. I had been in that emergency room twice at that time. So when I moved back to New York had been living in Greece. I was sick. And I knew the emergency room that was the center of all this. And about a month before, they had started to trickle in this story of the COVID from China, right? But I wasn't really paying attention. But about a month before they really pulled the trigger in the U.S., I started to feel bad. I couldn't breathe, and I would have to lie down in the afternoon. And my husband was like sort of laughing at me. He would call it my spells, because it's like, why don't I feel good? And then later I realized that I think something was released. They were working on the subway there, maybe under cover of that. There was something going on to get asthmatic people and stuff like that to go to the hospital, I think. Anyway, so that the minute they pulled the trigger on this, we knew it was bullshit. We knew, and also everyone in the neighborhood knew. Like our building had doormen, and the shop steward of the doormen's union, there was a friend of ours, and he was originally from the Dominican Republic, and he's like, in 2 weeks there's going to be Homeland Security in these streets, and they've come to take our rights away. And this was at the very beginning when they started to say the 2 weeks of, we're shutting down the city or whatever, which seemed surreal. Anyway, we knew right away, although because I felt bad at that time and I hadn't figured out why, I thought maybe there is something that's being exploited, and my husband was like, this is ridiculous. There's nothing. This is the thing that we knew was going to happen. And in fact, for the whole year before that, I had been doing SoundClouds about, the siege and the plan, the ruling class agenda now. And this fit in perfectly. But to be honest, I was still really shocked because I can't believe they got away with it. But so we knew right away. And then with virology, I'm obviously considerably older than you are. And when I was in high school and college, virology was taught as that it was controversial. We weren't taught that this is a fact, that there are viruses and they work this way. So I don't know when that turned into a fact, maybe a week before COVID. Before that, everyone accepted that this is a controversial subject. Going back, also, it means I lived through in Manhattan, that AIDS, the beginning of AIDS. We saw all this unfolding. I don't know. There was something.
All the same characters did the exact same thing.
Same characters, a murder program. There was something. I don't know how it was spread. There was something. I was quite involved in this because I had friends who were affected. And I have to say, even then, back then, I realized at first I was like, I thought this is real, not the HIV. There was AIDS first, and then they discovered the HIV. I have a friend he's actually living here as well now. He was one of the first people to get an HIV positive test. He was gay, he went to get the test. And it said he was positive. He went home, he cried. He woke up the next morning and he said, wait a second, I feel fine. I'm not sick. There's nothing wrong with me. And they terrorized him, the doctors, everyone, to try to get him on a drug, and he wouldn't do it. And he's never been sick. And I know him now. It's many, many years later. They said, if you don't take this AZT, you're dead in 6 months. And then 6 months later, they said you'll be dead in a year, et cetera, et cetera. Now they killed a lot of people, just like with the ventilators. Then, as Carrie Mullis said, they had to make the drugs less lethal, or people would stop taking them.
Yeah, they kind of
My
dropped the dosage,
earbuds
didn't they?
just
I think
said
it started at
something
like
to me.
1,500 milligrams of AZT, which killed them within like 6 months. And then they dropped
I had
it.
a really good friend, a woman with a really difficult history, or like overcame a lot of things, and she got AIDS. She got actual AIDS. She got Kaposi's, and she went to the no, she got AIDS. She got pneumonia and all these. Oh, and she was Haitian, so they had. Remember, they were saying, "Oh, the Haitians have it." So they judged her this way. They gave her the test, and then her boyfriend came up from the South, and he fed her and took care of her, and she got better. She got completely better. But then they put her on AZT. Then she got the Kaposi's, and then she was dead in about 4 months. And this is after having been sick, having had this syndrome, and actually seemed to be completely recovered, put the weight back on and everything, just with the usual things that you would do if someone is having. And she was 25, and they basically killed her with that drug. Okay, so anyway, we knew that was bullshit. The COVID, I still can't believe they got away with this worldwide siege thing, but that's what it was. And then you were talking about the Rockefeller Foundation. I remember the lockstep thing as one of these fantasy scenarios. They put out this brochure, like, and it was like a comic book, right? It had pictures and.
Quick divergence here, because we touch on it, although we don't really go deeply into the document itself. But the document we're talking about here is Operation Lockstep by the Rockefeller Foundation. That came out in May 2010. So they've had this in the pipeline for a long time. And if you remember the film Contagion, which was even the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, was even credited on that film. And you basically see that's the first time they introduce like the terms like lockdown and social distancing, that kind of thing. And if you go into that document, you see how they are basically planning for a global pandemic alongside hack attacks and so cyber shutdowns, that kind of thing. And if you go into the document, it's pretty much play for play what they did in the COVID pandemic. So if we read this, however, a few countries did fare better. China in particular, the Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as instant and near hermetic sealing off of all borders, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries and enabling a swifter post-pandemic recovery. Another important bit is, at first the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in the ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms. Biometric IDs for all citizens. I'll read that again. Biometric IDs for all citizens, for example, and tighter regulation of key industries whose stability was deemed vital to national interests. And then another very important quote is, you see how they completely censored the internet for that period and imposed the kind of regime of self-censorship on people. But if you notice how this fella here, G.K. Bhatt, some fella from India, it is possible to discipline and control some societies for some time, but not the whole world all the time. So you see the restrictions that they've recently lifted off on YouTube. Loads of people are coming back onto YouTube. Yet Jackson Hinkle just got back onto YouTube. I think Alex Jones might even be back on YouTube. Loads of these people are all kind of back. And you see here as well, by 2025, people seem to be growing weary of so much top-down control and letting leaders and authorities make choices for them. Wherever national interests clashed with individual interests, there was conflict. Sporadic pushback became increasingly organised and coordinated as disaffected youth and people who had seen their status and opportunities slip away largely in developing countries, incited civil unrest. In 2026, protesters in Nigeria brought down the government, fed up with the entrenched cronyism and corruption. Even those who liked the greater stability and predictability of this world began to grow uncomfortable and constrained by so many tight rules and by the strictness of national boundaries. The feeling lingered that sooner or later something would inevitably upset the neat order that the world's governments had worked so hard to establish. So even back in this document, they had already predicted that by 2025, people would be getting fed up of the lockdown restrictions. They would have liked to have carried this on longer, especially with zero COVID and China pushing that on all the communist parties worldwide, but they were unable to, particularly because they got backlash from China itself when there started to be riots and stuff about the ridiculous zero COVID that they enabled on their own countrymen and then tried to push on all the other communist parties worldwide. And you see, yeah, so they've been thinking about this for a long time. So to 2010, they're planning like up to 2030 here. And it's interesting that Nigeria is mentioned in this block here, and Nigeria is mentioned here in 2026, when the US regime is currently trying to overthrow the Nigerian government. Anyway, some interesting points from that document I wanted to highlight. It's a very interesting document to read in its entirety. So you can see like the cyber attacks that they want to create, the pandemic, which they had in the bag from 2010 at least. I'm not going to read the whole thing because obviously, but yeah, read the document in the references. And there we go.
And then also they said they had agents to get the African American community to take vaccines. They trained hairdressers, people in the barber shop. It was like an old racist joke or something. Like, do you really think people are getting their medical advice in a barber shop? But they believed that because some consultant told them that, and it was absurd. But I remember the lockstep thing was like, this is how society could go. And there were 4 choices. I don't remember what the other ones were. And then, okay, so yes, the Communist Party of China, my hunch is that this whole thing was the trigger was pulled by Gates and Xi, and then everyone else was handed it as a fait accompli. If you don't come along, they're going to kill you or whatever. And then, and that, you know, my theory from the beginning before this started. Oh, and also I could tell you more things about the, you know, people I know and things that happened in COVID and before COVID with, because this euthanasia program was already going before, slowly, quietly in America and in Canada. But the ruling class would like to have the power that they've achieved in China. They'd like to have that everywhere. Well, I guess they almost do now.
It's a very interesting perspective. Yeah, I mean, Canada, with their euthanasia program, they've emerged as like the organ harvesting capital of the world. They get these.
Is that true?
Yeah. But the Belgians, they salivated it as well. I wrote an article a while back called "Scientific Killers, Volume 1," and that analysed the euthanasia in Canada. I didn't realise how fast it would move into Britain, which it basically all means. Yeah. Which they're rushing it through the courts now, and they're all doing all sorts, saying they're trying to say that you can't even stop like your granny from going for assisted suicide, as that would be kind of like interrupt. I forget the term of it, but it would be like a legal mechanism where you couldn't convince your granny to not kill herself. And,
or your child, even, I think, your teenager.
Yeah, or your child as well, yeah. During all the COVID stuff, I think the reason why I was led down such a bad path is CPGBL had their 9th Congress in 2021, and they basically rubbished everything as conspiracy theory. So this conspiracy stuff that I did, because I was a conspiracy theorist before I was a communist, because I didn't, you know, I saw 9/11 with my own eyes. I saw the Iraq War. I didn't trust the government. I didn't trust these people. So I was inclined to lean that way. But at the 9th Congress, they basically said the conspiracy theories are rubbish. And they made the same equivalent to a vaccine of like, oh, well, you get your apples from the store and that's made by capitalism and that doesn't poison you. So that it's embarrassing looking back, but that's I think this part.
But this is what old Trotskyist boilerplate. I mean, they're always sort of in a long time have been this way. But it was surprising because Harpal Brar was really, he went to China. I remember looking at a video, and he he scolded them. He scolded the academics who had invited him, and they said there's no such thing as a market socialism. And he was really good, you know. And then, but this is not surprising that his kids, you know, this is who they approach. Look at Christian Parenti, Pete Buttigieg, whatever they call him. He's changed it. It was Buttigieg. His father was a Gramsci scholar, you know. That's who they go to recruit, right? Is the kids of these radicals, because they know how to fake it. You know, I mean, they're not going to do like Has, what's his name? Yeah, I was on his podcast, but you know, he can't even fake it. But but I understand why a lot of people who adhere to these groups, they want to believe that, you know, there's a country with 100 million members of a real communist party and nukes and stuff. But now, since the beginning of the accelerated extermination policy in Palestine, nobody can believe that anymore. But I think that they did want, really sincerely, is hopium or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with that, I mean, you got China. They did nothing throughout the entire Gaza genocide.
Yeah.
And then in a trade dispute with the United States, they stop rare earths. I mean, how many nuclear bombs worth of ammunition and ordnance has been dropped on Gaza? Could they have done that without all that rare earth from China?
I mean, I think that Israel, whatever they had, what the Zionists had, the trigger man had, was used up in like a week. It's not, it's obvious that it's the entire global ruling class, because if anyone dissented, they wouldn't have to go to war. They would just make the phone call and say no, you know, because they all, right now, they all have their chips. But my perspective, I don't know if you read T. Moore's stuff in Magma magazine.
No,
his articles is like a comrade. I won't say his real name, but who he also wrote Virology, the series on virology.
Oh yes, I read that series. Yeah, that was fantastic.
Yeah, it's fantastic. He's a good writer. Also, he gets things across very clearly. But you know, conspiracy praxis, I think that essay is called. Now I've forgotten because I'm a little senile. So. Conspiracy praxis, but my view is that you know, the nations have pretty much been superseded, you know. But I don't like that there are a couple of people who write about transnational capital who think that the states are no longer good tools for the ruling class. That doesn't make any sense to me. But I think that you have to talk about transnationalization. Of course, they all have their personal interests, they all have collective interests and stuff like that, that there's struggles, but it's not like China versus the US. This doesn't mean anything anymore. And this is something that Huey Newton, you know, there are not a great many important American Marxists, but he's one, and that he wrote about back in the 70s. He called it intercommunalism, the essay, but that, you know, and this is the fact that after the Second World War, the ruling class that emerged, not damaged, you know, which was in the U.S., based in the U.S., Wall Street leading, well, industrialists on Wall Street leading, they worked to transnationalize. They knew what the problems of capitalism were. They know it better than anyone. They're trying to do capitalism, right? So they knew they had to get over it. And then they had almost been overthrown. They were overthrown in half the world. So they wanted to, they don't like capitalism. Capitalism was the situation they found themselves in, and they want to have something better. And then after the Reconquest, which Huey Newton didn't write about, obviously, but the reconquest of the Soviet Union and the socialist world, that, you know, it happened differently in China, but all of this, they didn't just put back what was there before. They put back something that they could control. They didn't just say, oh, let's create a capitalist rival for us so that we're back in the same situation where we're facing global revolution. Instead, they these countries were put together in a way that made this centralization of power possible. And then, of course, the digitality as the world system is the cage, that finalizes it all. And people don't realize, they think the money, they just spit it out of their ass. That's not where it came from. It came from the plunder of the Soviet Union. That was the richest society that had ever existed. That and China together, fabulously wealthy. They went and they took all that, and that went to Wall Street, and they built this cage around us with that. The dot-com, all of this was real money. Now they're trying to abolish money. Really, they're trying to separate capital liquidity from wage money, so to create something new. And this is their big difficulty and puzzle. And I don't think they're ready to, well, who knows? Maybe it'll happen tomorrow. I think they know that if they blow up the money, then they destabilize themselves. How are they going to control the groups that they've armed?
Yeah, I think what they like to do is introduce like a technocratic system where they have, instead of capital, they have like an energy accounting system, and then if you tie that to like your carbon limit or whatever, then you have effective control over populations. I think it's a really good...
they want to reduce the population enormously.
Absolutely,
that's a big thing. But yeah, they have to control. I mean, this is why they had to get their soldiers around all the oil, because if they had, let's say they'd blown up the money before 9/11, then the US ruling class, Wall Street, would be going and paying court to the Saudis, but also Gaddafi. Also, they had to destroy and completely destroy the societies so that nobody is a rival there. Destroy the treasuries, the ability to have a treasury, and this is why it was knowable, even with these excuses, and right after 9/11, and people I blame the Trotskyists, but people didn't. I mean, when Bush said we're wiping out Iraq's debt, and then he went around and twisted arms. He went to the Paris Club. He did all this. You have to write it off, not down, write it off. Then you knew that they were taking over, because otherwise the debt would have been the lever that they normally would. They spent all this time getting all these countries indebted, right? They couldn't indebt the oil producers, but they tried, and everyone else. So that showed you that they were going for it. They were going for changing the globe. They had a new vision, and maybe they've changed it, altered it a little bit, but it's the same. It's what's happening. They want a new slave society, which a much smaller ruling class with no middle class, nobody like living okay, and they have to depopulate the consumer centers before they can depopulate the slaves. Otherwise, the consumers won't be able to. They'll get wise to what's happening. So that's my view. That's my big view here.
Yeah, I think I've come to agree on both accounts, because there's a lot of stuff that I read from like Russian conspiracy sites, what I've been able to translate and stuff, and what I've come across is like Andropov was he was in the 5th Directorate of the KGB, and in he came up with the idea of what did he call it? Conversion. And his plan was to merge the Soviet Union with NATO, and it basically exploit the entire world. And that came to bits, and then Gorbachev and Yeltsin ended up being the kind of ultra left of that. So what you've kind of got in Russia at the minute is kind of almost a 5th Directorate, kind of 5th column in Russia. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the banker of Russia at the minute, but she's implementing like all sorts of interest rate rises, which seem to be decimating the Russian economy, which kind of goes with that theory.
Well, they worry. Yes, I mean, and Putin, of course, was Yeltsin's minder, Yeltsin's KGB minder, and he also, with Ariel Sharon at the time, introduce the new normal of war on terror in terms of the kinds of things you could do to a population and everything, and still be. And I didn't know about Andropov. I always thought like if he had that he was like the last Soviet, but
Yeah.
I don't know
I-
enough. I won't argue with you about it. I'm going
Yeah.
to go look it up after. But but I agree that the Putin's a partner. Also, all of them have to look out for because these people all kill each other, right? At the drop of a hat. So they all have to look out for their personal power. But Putin and Xi have the difficulty that the US doesn't have of potentially revolutionary populations. So they worry about that. So everything they do has to serve, and all the ruling class now with their AI and everything, they're very good at stacking the functions, at having one policy that has to do 7 things. And controlling their population, preventing the resurgence of a meaningful resistance is one of the things. And that's why they're obviously just killing all the young men in the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine and Russia together. It said something about Zelensky's sponsor, but the whole oligarchy of Russia took Israeli passports at some point, whether they were Jewish or not, or theoretically Jewish. They waived all these things because of the prosecutions and everything that was going on in the transitional period, and a lot of people were sort of fled. A few extremely violent years also in Georgia and elsewhere, and fled to Israel, and were just, they brought money with them, they were given, and also they were in on this enormous plunder, right? So their resources are connected to a sort of, it used to call these networks mafia, but there's nothing else right now. So and even with Israel, like once again, this topic, I don't want to pontificate about it, and I don't know that much about it, but what I do know though is that even the neoliberal, the rising of the vanguard that happened under the Bush regime, at the same time it happened in Israel. There was an old Zionist who wanted to be the regional power. They hired Arafat to get them peace and all this, and they wanted to be the tech giant. They want to get rich. That's what they wanted, and have a rich society. Obviously, what's going on now is not that. It's something else. So they got rid of those people. And Netanyahu is really an American. They put him in to be the Bush, the daring one, to transform Israel and maybe Israel, I hope they'll actually be defeated, be genuinely defeated. I don't have, I hope. I can't let go of the hope. But it's clear that whatever they're doing, whatever the policy is, a lot of these Israelis have fled. It's not, they're not the society that they were imagining that they would win with Oslo, that's not the agenda now. It's something much bloodier, and obviously they want to kill everybody. They want to just depopulate the whole region.
Yeah, David Miller, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's like a Bristol University professor, and he won like a court claim against being anti-Semitic at Bristol because he was dismissed, and then he came back to the court claim and won the court claim that he wasn't anti-Semitic, he was anti-Zionist. And he's put an interesting video last night about he calls it Pax Judaica, and he describes like the Zionist movement and how, like, because the traditional view is that US imperialism heads over Israel, but Israel itself is emerging as a world power, and it's sort of affecting the rest of the world as a world power would. But yeah,
I don't think that's real, just because on paper it doesn't make sense. There has to be some magic. It has to be some like, how? They don't have the money. What? How would they control? I mean, what is it that it's supposed to be? Is it imagining? I think this fantasy comes out of the fact that there is a new power. It's the new vanguard of the ruling class, the billionaires. They are linked to their power is not capitalism. It's the telecom grid. It's the cage. That seems very mysterious to people. And of course, there are prominent Jews in that. Although the most known and visible people, Musk, Gates, Bezos, these Omidyar, they're not Jewish, but there are a few, Larry Ellison or whatever, but they want to. There's an impulse to expel this from the Anglo-American, that it can never be this bad. They can never. There's wanting to orientalize it. That's using Israel as the Orient, even though the whole argument is based on the fact that it's actually a European colony, etc. So it's like a confused thinking. But but this whole thing is like it's always to try to even these kinds of gimmicks of making the empire turn out to be the victim at the end, innocent, as being an intruder is coming to corrupt it or whatever. This goes back to Europe, Asia. But it works even best when the scapegoat that's chosen really does have a prominent function. For example, after 9/11, you're too young to remember, but the word that was used was not Israel, it was Cheney. It was Dick Cheney, who actually was the lead player in this, right? So, but even Dick Cheney in this rhetoric of liberalism can be turned into the Oriental intruder, the poison except for him, there's another system that's functioning in a different way. And that is what something like, I didn't read this article, maybe it's better than that. But I think that just proposing that, what it does is conjure this idea that there's another society, another imperial society that functions in a different way and is still there. And that's not true, obviously. The ruling class has a vanguard. Mom and pop, even retailers might want to function in the old capitalist system, but the ruling class they're into the next system already. The commanding heights of the economy is not running in capitalism, which was a situation that required distributed wealth and power and competition, even in its monopoly state. It still had to have blocks of that. And now they're moving out of it. That's my belief. But again, now I'm saying this, and it'll make it sound like I don't think Israel's a baddie or something. But that's obviously not true. I mean, Israel, as the trigger man, this is the most sadistic beyond thing that's ever happened. And I would say even Nazis don't compare, although they may have wished to, but they didn't have the power that is now in this program. But it's the program of the whole ruling class. They want to exterminate. Gaza is happening now. They locked down the whole planet before. What they're doing in Haiti, there's other places, but they want to eventually it's for the whole planet, which is not to say, and I hate when people say that it's rehearsal or something like that. They have to get rid of the Palestinians because they're also they're very radical, they're potential leaders of a renewed worldwide movement. So and that's why they also are particularly sadistic in Haiti as well. This is people don't surrender.
Yeah, I've written many times on Haiti saying that the future is Gaza and Haiti. Because if you look what they do in Haiti, they have UN troops go in and they basically rape a population. They actually rape the population as like 50, a form of 50, control.
Rapes.
Yeah, they release all sorts of disease on them, like all the cholera outbreaks have come from like UN camps and stuff like that. So that's definitely what they want for them. Did you follow any of the death protocols that were unleashed, particularly in Britain? That's the one I've studied the most, but I have studied a bit of America. And they did almost exactly the same thing during COVID. Yeah. To rack up.
I see. Well, this was another thing. So I was living in New York. I was living in the epicenter of the epicenter. But every single person, and I grew up in New York, and every single one that I knew in New York, the friends that I still knew, even people I didn't hardly talk to anymore, just saw them on Facebook, who had someone in a care home, whether they were aged or disabled, lost that person during during Cuomo's massacre. And then I had a friend, and there was an attempt to do a do not resuscitate order, but the New York City Police Department and the paramedics said, this is a criminal. We can't do this. They refused. But I had a friend who had a tenant for a long time in Brooklyn, a woman in her late 60s who was you know, pretty healthy, I guess. And anyway, she died. And then I was talking to her children, and they were very sort of, they didn't feel entitled to complain about anything interesting. So I was talking to her children because I went to that apartment while they were cleaning out her apartment. And they told me, and oh, right. And I knew that this woman, she died of COVID, but she had been in the hospital for a month. So then the kids told me that she was on a ventilator for a month. Now you simply, if you are a sick person, you cannot be on a ventilator for a month. You have to be the strongest human being on the planet. So they told me though, also the young doctors, and this was in Methodist, which is a notorious hospital in Brooklyn, the young doctors kept calling them and saying, you'd have to ask us to detubate her. It'll be risky, but you have to ask. We're not allowed to do that on our own. So you have to decide. And they were like, but we don't know. We're not doctors. They just weren't the kind of people who are going to assert themselves. They were like, you're the doctors. You have to decide. And they called them every week and said, you have to decide. And they were trying to prompt them to say, take her off the ventilator. But they couldn't say that. But they were sort of confessing that they had been ordered to keep her on the ventilator. So eventually, after a month on the ventilator, obviously she starved to death or something. They killed her. But it was COVID. They kept saying it was COVID, you know, and then there were other things that people were, you know, killed, put on vents allegedly to protect other people from COVID or something like that. Like that it was safer. But the year before that, my brother had endocarditis, you know, like pus in his heart. He had a floppy valve. He was taken, it was a long story. He wound up in London, Ontario, in a big university hospital there, Western Ontario. And the doctors there, they kept giving him like more strokes. They wouldn't operate. I didn't know what was going on, but by chance, this is the only reason I'm happy I'm on Facebook. An old friend of mine from college, turns out is a big cardiothoracic surgeon. I said, no, they have to operate on him now. And the consultants, the doctor said, no, he'll be a vegetable. They showed us the MRI. His brain was full of infarcts. It was 14 infarcts. It was very scary. They said he'll be a vegetable. He'll be blind. He'll never walk. And our friend said, neurology is not a science. Make them do the surgery. And then they kept delaying and delaying. And I realized they actually had an order to not save him. Anyway, finally, like with a lot of screaming and a scene, there was a talented surgeon there. They did the surgery. He gave him and he had physically 100% recovery. He had one slight, he couldn't read like a crossword puzzle going up and down. He played basketball. He rode his bicycle. I lost one of my things. So, you know, they had an order to kill him. And they told us that, you know, this nightmare, that it was a mercy killing, you know? And
Absolutely.
that was about 3 months before they pulled the trigger on COVID.
Yeah, incredible. So in Britain, they did a very similar thing. I ended up releasing a documentary on it. I interviewed like a journalist who had been covering it right from the beginning. She was approached by a man and was like, "Oh, the hospital killed my family member for no reason whatsoever. They just put them on. They gave them midazolam and morphine. That was the thing that was used to kill people here." Because midazolam and morphine suppresses your respiratory system, and then if they stick you on a ventilator, you're 100% going to die. And they stuck. Right. And if you watch my documentary, it's absolutely shocking. We visited 10 families that had a member killed, and they, you know, that's all they think about. They're active every day, pushing that their family member was murdered. You know, they're standing outside hospitals with signs. You know, they're at that level of desperation. Yeah. And it's just unbelievable. But in Britain, we've had a Scottish and UK COVID inquiry. And when I first heard about it, I was thinking that's probably just going to be a whitewash. They're going to say some things and it's going to be rubbish. It's been the absolute opposite of a whitewash. They've got literally hundreds of people saying that they forged do not resuscitate orders on their their family member,
Right.
that they ventilated them, that they put midazolam and morphine into them. There's been a Dimmock case, which is, it has had some fiery speeches going on in it, and that person was killed with midazolam and morphine too, and you could trace it exactly to NG165 and NG191, which were two documents. It's called the NICE guidance, and it's basically you'd think it is. From the sounds of it, you think of it as like a Quango setup that has to investigate the protocols for nurses and doctors, that kind of thing. But it actually answers directly to the health secretary. So essentially the government. It's a government protocol set by the highest person, like in government. Yeah. And yeah, it's in those documents. It says not to worry about giving midazolam and morphine together because that they might cause respiratory difficulty. And it just says, don't worry about it. That's literally
don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's literally the line here. Where families were denied access to their loved ones and controversial medical protocols led to countless deaths. The Scottish COVID inquiry opened some people's eyes to the scale of these events, exposing what some believe to be a deliberate effort by a complicit media to obscure the truth. Reports of withheld food and water, the use of powerful sedatives like midazolam and morphine, and the blanket imposition of do not resuscitate orders paint a chilling picture.
Because that's it. I said, just give my mom palliative care medicine, so I'm getting used charged with my 35 pounds to my mum. But we weren't allowed that. We weren't allowed to do anything. These murders didn't take place in isolation, but in context of a giant population pyramid with an aging population. Rising pension liabilities, economic pressures, and a colossal national debt with a rotten economic mode of production incapable of solving these issues without a mass culling or a mass rearmament for war. One question remains. If the government claimed to prioritise protecting the elderly in 2020, why and how were protocols like NG163 and NG191, alleged to have hastened thousands of deaths, implemented? The reason I included this clip from my documentary is because A, you should go and watch it, and B, to get the exact wording of the NG163 document, which you can't access via the NG website anymore. You can only access it via archive.org and then using their Wayback Machine. But the exact wording is sedation and opioid use should not be withheld because of a fear of causing respiratory depression. Midazolam and morphine kind of work together. So as you take them, it exacerbates the effects of both, which is how they managed to kill so many people using these NG documents.
They turned these things in the hospitals into death camps. Yeah. And then in Elmhurst, they'd hired some woman who was in New York Times. And then I looked her up. She was supposed to be a nurse or something, but she was a specialist in simulated something or whatever. To carry out the program. And then later, even the real orderlies and stuff. And my husband and I walked over there the day there was supposed to be a morgue and overflowing hospital. I said, let's go over. And so we went over. Emergency room was totally empty. There was no morgue. The ambulances were sitting outside idling. We stayed there for an hour. Nobody came. Nobody. That was supposed to be the height when it's overflowing hospital and you can't go in.
Yeah, Ken
it was
McCarthy,
like completely invented. But they killed all these people in New York. They did this thing where they forced somebody to make extra ventilators. And there was one very courageous doctor, I think from NYU, a young resident who did a YouTube, was like, they're killing people with the ventilators. Now he thought it was a sort of innocent stupidity. He's like this, and then they were raising that in Italy. They were doing something else, what they called the pig roast, where they were putting people on their stomachs and they were getting better or whatever, helping them breathe. But, that's another thing here. I mean, since I've been living here, I realized that, the head of the 5-Star Party, who actually he was Conti, it was sort of independent, the prime minister, he went to China the week before, came back and did the lockdown, expanded the lockdown here in Europe to normalize it. obviously, and I think that whole movement, now I think the whole 5-star movement, I think it's a little bit of a, I think they get their money from China. They're very big into the Belt and Road and all this stuff. And, you know, not that they're the intruder, you know, like I don't want to make them into the Oriental intruder, but, you know, they carried it out. I still can't believe it. And now, isn't it strange that people seem to have forgotten that this went on for 2 years, right? How long did it go on in Britain?
Well, it's still reports that Jackie Devoy gets that it's still going on, but not to the degree that it was going on before. So in Britain, we had the Liverpool Care Pathway, it came about in the late thousands, and it was essentially for people that were on death's door. They would kill them off, and essentially the way they did that is withholding fluid and food, and then giving them midazolam and morphine, because as they kind of get weaker from having lack of sustenance, they then basically get their respiratory system depressed. And that is like word for word came back into essentially law in 2020 under NG163, that document. But NG191, that's another document that they use to treat so-called COVID. That has to use remdesivir, which is that discredited drug which murders,
that kills you very fast.
It kills you very fast, completely destroys your kidneys and liver, and it kills you very quickly. And it says to treat COVID, with that. And I don't think they had all their ducks in the row, because the World Health Organization put out a document in 2020 saying that remdesivir shouldn't be treated for COVID because it's a terrible drug. So I bet
they still used it.
Yeah, but obviously that's gone now. You have to go on archive.org to get that URL.
Yeah. No, but they still used it. I think they got rid of, you know, at first they were dealing with institutions that were in the state they were in before the program began. And in the first months, they got rid of a lot of people, and they managed to, you know, suppress what a vaccine is, what, you know, like all this, you know, dystopia. I mean, it's hard to believe that they carried it out. And then later people thought, well, you got these alleged, you got a lot of fake critics also, the far right trying to jump on that but they were prepared to do that, to make it that and say, oh, sheeple, everyone deserves it, they're all going along. It's like in my neighborhood where all this started, nobody believed it. Nobody, really, I would say almost nobody, like some of the gentrifiers. This was a neighborhood that was mostly immigrants, you know, who had experienced tyranny. A lot of them were coming from Caribbean countries that had been, you know, under the imperial boot, and they had no illusions about the U.S. empire. But nobody believed it. And then they terrorized people so much and killed so many people that some people started to be afraid, you know, afraid of catching something. We had neighbors who were, you know, in the masks all the time. But when it first started, it was just, you know, I don't know. I think it was this sort of Pareto number. There were they figured out they had these sort of white clerk, not the racial, well, it was racial, you know, that's who it was. It was the gentrifying clerks in the US, in the urban centers who, you know, they became really Nazified, you know, turning people in. And
yeah, and all the people, I was shocked at all the people that came out demanding that people take like a vaccine and saying that, like, wishing death upon them and stuff.
Even the president did that, which he never had seen it before. Yes, wishing them dead, and and really hate. I mean, and this sudden. So about virology, like up until that minute, everyone understood virology is controversial within itself, right? That virologists argue. But also, and then really only from Phil Greaves did I start reading some of these more devoted critiques of the idea of the virus. But even in even within virology, people used to admit, like, this is a theory about these chains of proteins And we don't really know, it's a theory. And you can tell from the theory has everything wrong with it that all this bourgeois science has, like with genes and stuff like that, thinking that and then you get deeper into it, you see that they're really trying to, that, because of its usefulness for pharma and all that, it's been, like race. Like biological race, like people, you say virus and Harvard University and their donors throw money at you to go try to find it, to try to prove that it's there. But the criminalization of the critique of virology really, that didn't exist in 2019 even. Obviously, Bill Gates is a big factor of trying to establish some kind of consensus in science and get rid of what dialogue remains. But this attitude, and then I don't know, it became everything. You were post-rational. Everything got attached to Trump. If Trump said something, then it was evil, and if he was against it, it was right, or something. It became completely infantilized cues, like cartoon or something. The thing that freaks me out is I think people have repressed it. They don't think about what they thought, how they put up with it, but to the point where you could do it again.
Yeah. 100%, because they've kind of, you mention it now, like my documentary is 2.5 hours long, so it's quite long, but in that I kind of cover, I cover the interviews with all the family and interspiced with like clips from the Scottish and UK COVID inquiry, showing that all these people had their DNRs forged, that they were put on midazolam and morphine, that they were put on that they had food withheld, that they were ventilated, they had remdesivir, that kind of thing. And then toward the end of it, I bring in virology and like question the entire of virology and just include some quotes from a bunch of different books that are critics of virology. But even bringing that up, some people have just been like, oh, it's terrible, isn't it? And then that's it. They're completely uninterested. When I first heard about the death protocols that had been unleashed in Britain, like I interviewed Jackie Devoy, and I was like really interested. And I was like, oh, if only more people knew. But people are kind of wanting to repress it for, obvious reasons, self-interested ones, I think.
And there's a lot of guilt. A lot of these people, I see, people that I went to high school with, mostly like bourgeois on Facebook. I'm not in touch with them, but I see them, and, they tortured their own children. And I think this is very hard. They could even accept their own stupidity, but what they did to their kids, I don't think they can ever admit, ever. And they vaxxed them too. And now they don't know what they've done. They don't know what the effects on their grandchildren will be. They don't know, on children born to vaccinate. They don't know if they cut 20 years off their life. They have no idea. So I think there's terror, but also there was this temptation in a lot of these people that they were going to get to be, they live in a society now where there's a vanguard that's over them. They're bourgeois, they live okay, but they live among these very, very rich and powerful people. And I think COVID told them they were going to have slaves, coming to their house masked. They like that, the locking down other people, being able to ask people in the street, where's your pass? What are you doing in the street? There is a very something, but not everyone. I think that was a small group, and then there was a larger group around them. Psychologically, it's not even that important because it didn't get the masses of people. The reason that we couldn't do anything about it, that the majority of people couldn't do anything about it, is because of our political disarray, not because of the enemy was not within the heads of the most people, right? The enemy was literally had planned this and knew how to, because people really tried to rescue their family but I was remembering as you were talking with the midazolam and everything, which is a drug they use to execute prisoner, to do the death penalty. So, but when I was in Canada trying to save my brother, when they were trying to come, and they took they took his like 13-year-old daughter aside and terrorized her. They used all these techniques to try to get the family to say, okay, kill him. And then at one point we were like, oh no, let's see that famous Canadian health insurance at work. We want this $500,000 surgery. But one thing I found out that nobody's entitled to care in Canada. The College of Physicians decides whether you get care or not. Nobody's entitled. I said, he's a Canadian citizen. Is he entitled to this surgery? They said no. And then the other thing they did, what you were saying, they said, you don't even have to kill him. If we just don't do anything and we don't feed him, he will die in 2 days or whatever. That's what they said. And that was probably true. They did the surgery at the last minute. So it was that same thing, like, oh, this is okay. You're just letting, like, and then the idea was like a human being is so fragile. We're not what we are. We really depend on the ruling class to keep us alive, and we should be forever grateful to them. And then the other thing is, so after we forced them to do the surgery, they did the surgery. He finally came off the ventilator. He had a feeding tube. It took him he was so starved, and it took him about 3 days to open his eyes and talk after this. But they had a feeding tube in him. And one day we were like, let's just look at what they're giving him. And you know what? It was Nestle, and it's corn syrup. That's all that they give you in the hospital. And you can go and buy, or you can even make a feeding tube yourself, which is what my sister-in-law wound up doing. I mean, make the bag. But they're basically, even when they seem to be feeding them, they're killing them.
Yeah, that's the point that Vernon Coleman appeared on my documentary, and he's been a dissident doctor for over 30, maybe 40 years. He's quite
I know
quite an old man now. But he made the point that back in like the 1970s in one of his books, obviously I've only read this in the last couple of years, but he made the point that when you go into hospitals, they don't give you nutritious enough food. So you need to actually take in nutritious food for yourself. And that, you know, that was in the 1970s. And now if they're doing that and they're actively wanting to kill people off, they want to appear to be feeding them whilst actually starving them from any nutrients that would heal them.
Yes, they're starving them. And, we could combat this before the COVID because most people had someone who could come and take care of them. And then they started barring the families so they could just starve people. And then with older people, like, it doesn't take very long to starve them. With young, strong people, it's not so easy if they're getting enough calories. But like all these people that I knew who had parents or, maybe they had dementia. Another thing that needs to be looked into, mysterious deaths. Some of them attributed to COVID, some of them not. People who had been in pretty good shape. They starved them. And just that you could carry out this extermination program. And a lot of people knew that it was happening and we're trying to fight it and we couldn't do anything about it. That is like what we have to figure out next time. I mean, now it's happening like with Gaza, of course, it's far away from us, from many people, but it's not, we're closer to where where it's happening, where the command is than the fighters, so our disarray is a real, and this is why people like Jody Barr are so important, because I think otherwise that was actually a pretty good little formation, wasn't it? Like the people in the Communist Party of Great Britain, most of them are.
Yeah, it was. They kind of liquidated the party in 2020 for the Workers' Party, which is Galloway's lot.
I saw your article about that. Tell me about that. I didn't know what happened there.
So essentially they went into a coalition with George Galloway and creating the Workers' Party, and it was supposed to basically be a front for the Communist Party, but it quickly took on a kind of life on its own, and then like members of the CC got a bit bureaucratic with the Workers' Party, and then it eventually formed a split. I mean, this is like Leninism 101, liquidationism, but that's the way it goes. Yeah. And then Harpal died earlier this year.
Right, but I wonder what he was thinking toward the end there, because he had to know that his kids had gone over to the enemy. He had to know, but there's children, I guess so. different. But I mean, he never really, he didn't push the COVID shit, did he? No.
No, not. I never heard him personally push that COVID shit.
No.
There were some
but
interventions from Ranjit, and it's quite a
Yeah.
funny
Oh,
intervention.
he's a doctor, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. That's why.
Yeah.
That's why his word carried quite a lot of weight back in
Mhm.
the 9th Congress. And he basically, someone tried to put an anti-vax position across, which
Yeah.
the history of vaccines, I've read about them now. Good grief.
Good
What
grief.
they originally called a vaccine was like literally scratching pus into people's arms for like smallpox
Right.
and stuff like that. That was from like
Right.
dead
Literally.
animals, and then they eventually got it into like an intravenous muscular injection. But yeah, at the 9th Congress, he got everyone to hold their hand up if they believe 9/11 a conspiracy, and then said, "Oh, you see, there's a bunch of conspiracists that believe a bunch of daft stuff." And then a couple of years later, he's on his YouTube talking about Building 7.
Wow, really? Yeah, somehow that had like Grace Belden became the. No, I remember it, but it was like the Trotskyists really did, because of course in New York, I'm a New Yorker. Like on September 12th, everybody knew that story wasn't true.
Yeah,
everyone.
I remember it at
And
the
then
time.
by the end of the month, and it was the anthrax that terrorized people. And because even after 9/11, they thought they would get the Patriot Act signed just with 9/11, but 9/11 didn't work. It was too cinematic. They fucked it up. One of the planes was late. Everything went wrong. And then the anthrax, though, that scared people, and that terrorized the rest of the resistance within the governing class, and then they got it. But that was, and I think the same with COVID. Like you have the original disbelief, and then something happens, and it's terror, and it's carrot and stick, and it's all this stuff. But now now you can do it because it's expired, just like everything else, just like every other bit of history, imperial history. It's every conspiracy is known except the one right now.
Absolutely.
That one's you're demonized for. Although I think they sort of, in a way, when I call it my substack, the disorient, I think they've given up these. I think they had to trade that in a little bit for other kinds of gains. Like they've lost the ruling classes, the media has lost its legitimacy, and they're counting on trickier things now to control people than this consensus that they used after 9/11.
Yeah,
which didn't work. And that was another thing that Trotskyists would say, and probably the young bras who were too young at the time, but oh, you can't say this because you're going to alienate someone, right? You're going to alienate. Meanwhile, 9/11 Truth had 100 million Americans sympathetic to it, and most of the world. And then compared to like your little Trotskyist sect, I mean, 9/11 Truth is not alienating anyone. You're alienating people, and but that was the logic, that you wouldn't be clubbable. You couldn't go to. You're not going to get your Harvard fellowship, and that was true. Of course, you weren't going to get your. But now you could get your Harvard money too for 9/11 conspiracy.
Yeah, one of the resolutions passed at the 9th Congress of the CPGML was against conspiracy.
Yeah, you should read this conspiracy practice thing of T. Moore, who wrote the Virology articles, because he takes us through it. But also what drives me crazy is, like, if you read the political writings of Marx, I mean, what does he call the counter-revolutionaries in 1848? He calls, is it 18? Well, now I forget which one, when he uses this, but he calls them the slaveocracy, the slave owning conspiracy. It's all about conspiracy. The Communist Manifesto, it's like there's this holy alliance. That's a conspiracy. And of course they have to conspire. Why wouldn't you conspire? But also it's taking advantage of the de-skilling of middle management, because like my generation, those of us who are bougie, like I was, you have to conspire at work. You have to plan. That's what your job was, and so that nothing gets done.
Yeah.
unless you plan, and that you have to get your allies, and you have to make projections, and you have to know what the possibilities are of the outcomes of the things that you do. And then I think even if you ask people now, like, so let's say your job was to plan like 9/11, let's say that was your job, what would the factors be that you would consider? And they might not have been able to plan it, but they could come up with the same basic things. But when they see it in hindsight, it has to all have been an accident.
Yeah. I mean, you got Operation Northwoods, where it's essentially the same plan for 9/11, where they were going to use like pilotless planes, like drones, effectively, to commit terror attacks to blame on Cuba, so they could invade Cuba.
So they could invade, right, in a relatively small project, and then in this enormous project, and even with COVID, like maybe, I don't know, I have a feeling that it was a very small group, because it's so, but who knows? They weren't even after 9/11, they fucked it up. Everyone knew they did it, but they brazened it out with terror so with the plague program, I think it was a very small group, and then they got people on board. But I think people were already prepared, not just by these plague plans, but they were trying to achieve the same thing with the climate hysteria.
Yeah, definitely.
So they simply repurposed a lot of that stuff that they had worked on the fundamental levels of anthropology, like the idea that people are vermin, that we use too much, that carbon is all these things, that our breath, our children's breath is a poison. All this kind of stuff they'd already built it for the climate. So it was there. So they could make the COVID ideology very quickly, because it was simply a permutation of what they'd already been working on for 20 years.
Yeah, the eco-fascist movement, like the Greens, they're absolutely disgusting. I was pretty sympathetic before I was too politically aware. I was pretty sympathetic to the Greens, because who doesn't like clean air and lush areas and stuff? But I did research into it. Like the Green Party in Britain was originally the People's Party, and they were inspired by limits to growth. And yeah, and their whole thing was, we need to start sterilizing people now. We need to enact all these laws, like huge abortion laws. Like we've just got abortion right up till birth in Britain. Absolutely disgusting movement. There's a good book by Jacob Nordengard called The Rockefellers Controlling the Game, and it details with it's referenced to the nines about how the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller family were basically the people that created the climate movement and used it for essentially what is known as eugenics.
Right.
So I mean that's what we have now. That's why they're euthanizing people, and they've got some like guy in London at the minute who created the suicide booth. He's shown it off. Like I mean because already, and if you go back and you read that Club of Rome stuff, you see that they were already thinking past capitalism, because with capitalism you need population, the more the merrier, otherwise you can't get rich. But they were imagining, it's the dreams of the Dixie slaveholders of the new Memphis. They called their capital Memphis because they imagined themselves as pharaonic gods, and a system that was stable, where they were taking no risks, etc., and that they would make the underlings another species, right? They dream of the house elves, like in there. So, but you can see they're thinking past capitalism, but they're not there yet, so they couldn't really push their agenda yet. They had to work toward it, right? But there are a couple good books you should read. Jacob Levitch, on the Gates Foundation, because he mentions all this history and the books about it. But the Rockefellers, and then what was amazing to me, there's this woman named Michelle Goldberg. She writes for The Nation in the U.S., which of course started out as left-wing magazine, and then it was sort of progressive. And but she became this worshiper of the Gates Foundation. She wrote a book on population. Now I can't remember the name of it, but it was like a neo-eugenicist tract coming from the left.
talking about, and at the same time saying, oh, it's very important, it's very worrying that there's a birth strike in Europe, that the Europeans, which he considers the real Europeans, aren't having enough babies and everyone else is having too many. And then she says things like, well, we won't be able to, setting up the austerity, that we won't be able to, there are not enough young workers to take care of all these Italians who live to 100. And then she says, because the immigrants won't want to pay taxes and take care of them, which is just like the most amazing thing. If you've ever walked into a hospital in Italy, who is working there? But it's but saying, oh, unfortunately, Hitler gave eugenics a bad name, that it's really a wholesome socialist science,
Kind of like Fabian socialism, isn't it?
Exactly. And then she actually tried to float this as, that didn't quite work. People, one of the things is in the US, Catholic Church is very opposed to this. And that is one of the barriers that they face. But now they have the woke popes. Maybe that'll change too. But that was a big factor. And, people just don't, everybody knows it's wrong, right? And yet there's this brazen attempt to restore this, and the climate became the wedge, right? That we are a vermin on the planet.
There's a poster I like to repost every now and again. Baby or climate killer, but in German. I was going to tell you the German pronunciation of it, but I can't remember how to say it in German.
Okay.
And it's a woman holding a baby breastfeeding, and it says baby or climate killer, and that's up in like a metro in Berlin. So I mean, yeah. I post that on the regular because it's just, you look at that. I mean, what more can you say?
The world stands on the precipice of catastrophe. From the ashes of crumbling empires, new tensions rise. In Ukraine, the flames of imperialist proxy wars burn hotter. In Palestine, decades of colonial oppression erupt into resistance and brutal reprisals. Across Asia, the spectre of great power rivalry looms as the US and its allies encircle China, desperate to maintain their waning hegemony. Behind it all, the contradictions of capitalism drive the chaos. The ruling class, desperate to maintain power, sows division and war to distract from their failures. Exploited workers displaced by continued wars, coups, colour revolutions and manufactured economic crisis are pitted against each other, while the rich grow richer off the spoils of the conflict. But the people are waking up. From the picket lines to the barricades, the oppressed are uniting. The path to peace lies not in the hands of warmongers, but in the collective struggle of the working class. Only by dismantling the systems of exploitation and imperialism can we avert disaster and build a world free from war. The choice is ours, solidarity or annihilation. The time to act is now.
And then, of course, the imagination. I mean, I don't know. I don't like to go that postmodern, but there, of course, an enormous bibliography talking about, influence on people's paradigm, right? I mean, basically, they're to get to the core of our ideologic basis, but also morality. And then now there's this. People have really think that people are worthless, and of course, the screens have a lot to do with it. The ubiquitous screens and the sense of, although this failure to succeed in normalizing the extermination in Palestine makes me think that it's not working as well as we fear. And yet, when it's still somewhat abstract, like, oh, I keep dropping my earbud. Yeah. When it's still somewhat abstract, like like we're hurting the planet, like what does the planet mean in that sense? That people feel like they must say yes to that. Like otherwise they would be anthropocentric, or, you know, there's some unwoke thing that they are if they don't put the planet first. On the other hand, the violence that's being done to our natural, what belongs to humanity, is extreme, and it's the anxiety about that we all know that that's real, that they try to convert into the climate hysteria, right? That we know that they're destroying, you know, that spinach isn't spinach, that the air is poison, that and now they've gone into our cells with their, you know, I mean, and this is an ecological issue, right? The original environmentalists who would have been on the left were concerned about exactly these things, how much we're being poisoned and injured, and you know, the land is being destroyed, but now it's to enclose it, but they still, in order, if humanity is the enemy, then they have to destroy even some of their own assets to uproot us.
Yeah, definitely. But you still need like an industrial development and stuff. Like one of my first guests on my podcast was David John Douglas, and he was a representative in the National Union of Mine Workers. They were quite a particularly brave organization which shaped the political life of Britain from, well, since they formed until until Thatcher destroyed the coal industry. But he made the point that in Whitehaven, they were trying to open a coal mine or reopen it, I think. And Whitehaven's one of the most deprived places in Britain. You know, there's just drugs, despair. There's no one's got anything going for them. And you'd have like communists from all these different parties and sects that would turn up like in their shiny wellies and 4x4s, you know, protesting against the coal mine opening in one of the poorest and most deprived places in Britain. So I think there is a bit of give and take with the ecology. I mean, with industrial, and if you let a lot of areas go fallow and just kind of leave them alone as they kind of imagine this kind of like utopia of greenness, some of them just completely kind of collapse because they don't have man taking care of them. It's like what they've done in Australia with a lot of the bushes, where they're not clearing the bushes in the forest and then they're just burning down.
Right. I mean, we want the planet for us, not for itself.
Yeah. We only want the Earth.
And now it's very clear that the climate. Well, Bill Gates just suddenly said we shouldn't worry so much about climate because now they need all this. They need all these nuclear plants for their cage around us. Now that is like, maybe they'll try to sell that as industry, but it's not. It's obviously disempowering. Now, it doesn't mean that people don't work. I mean, that's another thing about robotic things, and people have to work. They're simply they're separated from the products of their labor, and it makes it harder to take control, right? I mean, in the area that Marx was imagining, we could, and obviously the revolutions occurred, like workers would go and they would have their hands physically on all the capital, right? They'd have their hands on the capital, the machines. And now with the new cage, digitality separates the slaves from the machines that they're operating, and so it just disempowers you. It doesn't really make you unnecessary. But what they're going to, I think, in terms of, I mean, the ruling class cares. They want their assets to be very green and beautiful, but the priority is to enslave everyone, and that's requiring sacrifices.
Yeah, and I mean, I've kind of envisioned it that they kind of want to roll back the proletariat as a class and kind of I don't know how you describe it, but yeah.
Well, even in the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, as people tend to forget this, that Marx says one of these classes is going to win or they're going to destroy each other. And that is sort of more what's happened, that the old bourgeoisie, the capital per se capitalists, and the proletariat, they're sort of transforming. Yes, they want to enslave everyone. I mean, I literally think they have a fantasy of, enslaving people changing, actually making a different species. This was always the fantasy of American slave owners in the South. They thought, oh, they can interbreed, they can do this. They thought could make, and you see their fantasy in Harry Potter. Those house elves are human. They know, they have the intelligence of humans that they can carry out tasks, but they don't want their freedom. And this is a fantasy, right, that they have. They'll never achieve it, but meanwhile, they want to make capacities to torture people remotely and kill them remotely, to turn you off, to just shut you off.
It makes me...
So there's a lot of obstacles.
Definitely. And with CRISPR technology, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
It
does make me wonder what is in those vaccines.
Yeah, I don't know what I think about that yet. I don't know enough. I probably can't. I need advice on it. What do you think it's for?
Well, I mean, CRISPR technology, I only have a layman's understanding of it.
Yeah.
But essentially, you can kind of splice and change bits of DNA to turn things off and on. They've done things like get rats and then sort of splice their DNA with kind of a jellyfish, and then you have glow-in-the-dark rats running around. So
right.
That's the thing that's been going for years.
I think the DNA is overrated. There's this guy, Michael Levin. You should...
Yeah,
do you know who he is?
I don't know him, but I've come across very recently a guy called, named Andrew Hoffman. I'll have to get his name up.
I don't know him.
I'll put it as a bit of text on the screen because I don't have his name to hand at the minute. But he's doing those virology studies at the minute, and he's basically doing what the virologists do, but with no infection in the culture that he's doing. So in virology they take that monkey kidney cells, they splash it with antibiotics, they poison the whole thing, and then they add nutrients to feed like this goop that they've made, and then they take pictures of like disintegrating cells and claim they're viruses. He's been doing that, and he's been taking pictures of all these disintegrating cells and with electron microscopy and comparing them to pictures of like various diseases they claim to have on file, and they all look the same. So, but he also has a whole thing about how DNA isn't really real. So I'm not really sure what to think about that in a minute. I'll have to.
DNA is real, but it's not doing what they think. That's another thing. Like these sequences of proteins are there that they call the viruses, but it's not doing what they think. So it's not that it's just a fantasy. But this guy Michael Levin is very interesting. Because he is not interested in the genes. He shows his theory, which is he was born in the Soviet Union, is based on Soviet science, but he's an American. He's not a communist, but he works for DARPA. He's got DARPA money, but he shows that all the cells are like neurons that are lower level. He talks about agential properties, will existing on a continuum, and intelligence or whatever existing on a continuum. And he shows that by stimulating cells to communicate in different ways, then he can make types of reptiles that don't usually regrow a leg. He can make them regrow a leg and stuff like that. He talks about the cells sort of being independent, a theory of sort of like Lynn Margulis, but that the cells have their own agency and they're functioning together, and he can manipulate them with light and different kinds of stimulation. But it's very, very scary because he's working on technology, obviously some of it that would be for the ruling class longevity, like how to make a heart regrow the way a liver can or stuff like that, but also how you would, fundamentally alter human development without this sort of building blocks from zero, understanding that life is very plastic, and we knew that already, right? Because we all start out with much the same, and then we all become quite different with different capacities. But so it's really scary stuff. But I think it's correct. That's the thing. I think that his point of view on bioscience is correct. Whereas the DNA stuff, this idea that there's programming, it's kind of like the viruses. It's like you could tell just looking at it, it's kind of shitty ideology. It's not it's not right. There are certain things that they observe that are correct and they can manipulate, like a gene that would, look, these people talk about, they think they can make house elves, but they can't, like, cure baldness, something that everyone wants, right? They can't figure out how to change your gene for that. So it's not, it's obviously a lot of four-flushing, but also I think because their paradigm is wrong, because they found it a convenient one. They were attracted to it, not because it was the best one, but because it was convenient for enclosing values and stuff like that, and for thinking and for their morality, when it's not really true. We're very malleable animals. So anyway, you should look at him. I'll send it to you. He's at Tufts, and he's really intelligent, really scary. And what's it's right, because it's scary as shit that you could see they could actually do these things.
Absolutely interesting. Is it a book he's released, or has he just got papers
He's
out?
He's got some papers out. He does a lot of videos that shows his work. Michael Levin, Dr. Michael Levin. He's on Twitter, and you can talk to him. You can engage him. But he published a volume of papers of Soviet biology from the 70s and 80s. That's the ground of this, and it's a very interesting volume. I'll send it to you after. But that stuff is, well, now we're getting into territory that maybe neither of us are experts in.
Yeah, definitely.
But I definitely think, I mean, now the more I read, was sort of inspired by Phil Greaves, but then I went and I discovered this Italian theoretical physicist who's dead mysteriously, and as was his partner, who was working at the end of his life. He was one of the inventors of string theory, but he was working at the end of his life on nuclear fusion, and he wrote a book with a journalist named Torialto, who's now in hiding, about the new generation of nuclear weapons that are obviously being used now in Gaza, but they've been used elsewhere, and Lebanon and Ukraine, probably Russia. And his name was Emilio del Giudice, and he had a quantistic theories about biology that were working on. He was working on water with a cell biologist, and this is also something Phil discovered about the easy water, about the water being basically, this is the answer to all the biological questions that have been overlooked, is water and the electromagnetic spectrum. And so his work is really, and this also, it ties into Michael Levin's work. These have the same basis of understanding, so that this idea of the DNA as the building blocks, and it's a program, and it's in you, and it's going to have a sort of predetermined future, like that's all kind of nonsense, I think.
Fascinating. Molly, I've kept you an hour and a half. I'll let you go.
It hardly seems that way.
What's that?
It hardly seems that long.
I know, yeah. It's flying by, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, I'll probably have you back on at some point. There's quite a lot I wanted to ask you about. I kind of wanted to get into kind of the ACP and Has, because he's a big kind of Dengist, and he's a very intelligent man, don't get me wrong. But
is he? I went, there's on YouTube, there's the podcast we did together. He kept sort of turning off my microphone, and then at one point I fell asleep. But yeah, it was very frustrating. Yeah. I don't know how smart he is.
Yeah, I mean, I saw him on, so he's gone to this right winger last night to discuss China and how China is still a socialist country run by a communist party, essentially, which I disagree with, but he makes a very good case for it. But the only problem is people aren't analysing kind of at a deeper level, kind of China's involvement in COVID, that kind of thing. Right,
that's the smoking gun. But the main thing is, like, it's what do they mean by socialist? If you ask them, you say, like, describe this to me, why this is good for the masses of humanity, but let's not use the word socialist, and they have nothing to say.
Exactly.
They only tell you why it's socialist, and then they go back and they say, oh, but NIP, Lenin did this. What these ridiculous, that have nothing to do with China. And that socialist becomes not in the word socialist. It didn't mean what revolutionary socialism, it meant the opposite of individualism. So in that sense, it is socialist, but it's still not something we want.
It's more kind of like
You know,
technocracy,
Nazism
you know?
also.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not, it just because, I mean, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx goes through all the bullshit socialism. There's 97 different types of bullshit socialism. Socialism doesn't mean good, but it's, I don't know. I talked to him for a long time. He's very into Heidegger. He likes all these fascist thinkers. I think that, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, this was really nice.